It is my honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speakers, Professor Dorothy Roberts, the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mussel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania, and an award-winning author of so many important books, including Shattered Bonds, Killing the Black Body, and her most recent work, Torn Apart, which she'll happily sign for you afterwards. And Andrea James, founder and executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and the founder of Families for Justice is Healing, author of Upper Bunkies Unite and Other Thoughts on the Politics of Mass Incarceration, a 2015 Soros Justice Fellow, and a recipient of the 2016 RFK Human Rights Award. Thank you so much. Thank you both for being here. Before we get started, many of us are really familiar with you and many are not. How did you each get into the work that you currently do? Andrea, I'll start with you. How did you get into this work?
Oh boy. Good morning, everybody. I just want to start by saying I was triggered by walking into a moot courtroom. Many days at Northeastern University School of Law that I got very familiar with this. But yours was very nice. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here with Dorothy Roberts, somebody that has informed our work forever. And I also want to say...
I'm that old.
Forever in our movement work around this. And it's an honor to be here with our dear comrades, Joyce McMillan. Is Nicole here yet? Is that a hand up? She's not here yet. Okay. And I just want to say Joyce has informed us and is the expert in this space. And I'm just really honored to be here and to be able to speak about our work. We started our work in a prison as incarcerated women in the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut in 2010. I'm a former trial lawyer and criminal defense attorney who did a tiny bit of real estate conveyance work that got me in a whole heap of trouble. And I was sentenced to serve a 2-year federal prison sentence. I had just had my last child. He was 5 months old. I was still breastfeeding him. And I had a 12-year-old daughter at the time and 2 young adult daughters. But I left those children and was sent 2 states away. I live in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in a home my family has been in for 5 generations. And I left my community and my family and my husband and my parents and my little baby boy. And I was there one day, remember buying this little stuffed animal and sleeping with it for months leading up to the time that I knew I had to go and report to the prison so that I could leave him with something. And one day that day came, and I had to get in the car with my family and drive myself to a prison. That's the privilege of being a lawyer. I was able to self-surrender, which is very unfamiliar with the other 1,800 women that I was in the prison with who hadn't seen their children since they were caught up in something and they looked out the rear window of a police car and saw their children being taken away by a stranger and literally had not seen their children for 6, 7, 8. Some had lost complete connectivity with their children. And as a woman who had just given birth and was going through all kinds of postpartum depression as a result of what was happening in my life at the time and being separated from my children, leaking from every orifice of my body still, I walked into that prison and met some of the most incredible women, many of them who I knew of the same women from my own community. I live in the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a Black community, buried under every policing system you can think about. But to go and live in a prison for 2 years with all this alchemy of professional and personal experience coming into that prison with all of that, it still did not prepare me for what I encountered, and the incredible courage and strength and determination of the women that were in that prison to not only make it through some very long and draconian sentences. Women we're still fighting to bring home. I've been home since 2011. They're still in that prison, and prisons all over the country, separated from their children. But we just decided in that prison, sitting at a table in the prison yard on a hot, blisteringly hot day, that we were going to work to end the incarceration of women and girls. And we meant it then, and we mean it now. And since that time, we've been working through an abolitionist Black feminist lens to figure out what different looks like. And that's the work and how we got involved in it.
And we're definitely going to talk about what that vision looks like in a little bit, because it's so important. And Dorothy, how did you get into this work?
It's so hard to pinpoint what it means to say how you got into the work you're involved with now. You know, I would have to go back to growing up with two parents who deeply believed in the equality of all human beings. That was their thing. And during the 1960s, protesting the war in Vietnam and being part of the civil rights movement from afar in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. I usually think about getting into the work by talking about my work opposing the prosecutions of Black women who were pregnant and using drugs in the late 1980s. That was my first scholarly project, an activist project, was opposing those prosecutions, and then thinking about all of the ways in which Black women's childbearing has been punished throughout U.S. history, starting with the exploitation of Black women's reproductive labor during the slavery era and the separation of Black families by enslavers, all the way through policies to today, and writing the book, Killing the Black Body, which then led me to realize and encounter the family policing system, the system of taking children away from their families that mostly impacts Black and Indigenous families in America, and getting involved with the reproductive justice movement, and then working on abolishing the family policing system. And you know, I don't want to mention all the names because I'll miss people, but just looking out into the audience, seeing Marty Guggenheim, who we've worked on this for more than 30 years, I believe, Joyce McMillan, comrades since I wrote Shattered Bonds over 20 years ago, and others. I'm going to stop there, but also thank you, Shanta and Andrea. Just happy to have these comrades in the movement as well. And now being part of this exciting movement to abolish family policing. I also though, have recently been asked questions about my abolitionist principles and commitment and how it relates to my personal experiences. So usually I think about my engagement with Black mothers from the late 1980s and their activism against the system that impacted them. Meeting with Black mothers in Chicago in the late 1990s to work on small efforts. These are just groups of mothers who are coming together because their children have been taken from them and giving support to each other. You know, I write about in Shattered Bonds in 2000, meeting with a group of mothers in a church basement in Englewood in Chicago, and that being part of how I began my activism against family policing. But now being asked about my personal experiences, including reporters asking about it, Shanta asking about it, people saying at a conference, for example, a couple of years ago, well, have you ever had your own experience with incarceration, which I never talked about. I'm not sure why. So Shanta asked me to talk about it, and so I will. So when I was a young mother, I had a baby, 3-month-old baby, and a 2-year-old son. I was married to a man who was a revolutionary in the Black liberation movement, whom I met in law school. And one night, I got a call saying the FBI and the New York Joint Terrorist Task Force is downstairs, let us in. I put my 2-year-old in the crib and carried the baby on my hip and opened the door to what seemed like dozens of police officers with guns drawn, demanding entry into my home. And they were looking for my husband. Rudy Giuliani, have you all heard of him? He was the U.S. attorney in New York for the Southern District of New York, and he decided to arrest my husband, my then husband, and 7 of his colleagues. He was the ringleader of a supposed terrorist gang. They ransacked my apartment, and they finally found all of the New York, what were called the New York 8. He was incarcerated under a newly passed federal law that allowed for detention without trial. As one of the Patriot Act's predecessors. This was in 1984. Incarcerated without trial. He was the only one that they incarcerated in federal prison. And then they subpoenaed all the partners of the New York 8, including myself, to the grand jury to testify. And we all refused to testify. When I think about it, it was both, what really had the most impact on me was not only the experience of visiting my husband and the others eventually who were incarcerated, but making the decision that I wasn't going to be intimidated by Rudy Giuliani and the New York police and the FBI, and I refused to testify. Now, Andrea talked about the privilege of being a lawyer. The irony of this is at the time, I was working for one of the most powerful law firms in New York City, and they gave me pro bono one of the leading criminal defense attorneys in the nation. And so I ended up not having to go to prison. But what had the most impact on me was making the decision that I would be willing to go to prison rather than testify against political prisoners and being supportive of political prisoners. So when I think about one of the most defining moments of my life was when I was asked to speak at rallies in support of the political prisoners because they did incarcerate the other partners who refused to testify before the grand jury. So it was my husband and the grand jury resistors who were in prison. And the experience of visiting them in prison, but also having to make the decision, am I going to testify, and also am I going to speak out against this political oppression? They had produced a flyer with me and my 2 young children, a picture of us, which they were putting around New York City. And my lawyer was saying, stay low, don't do anything, don't aggravate, Giuliani and his crew. And I made the decision, no, I'm going to speak out, and you can put the poster around New York City of me and my children protesting against what was a political vendetta against this group of Black revolutionaries who were fighting the police. Now, that experience made a big impact on me. It was part of what makes me an abolitionist. But also, I was an abolitionist before then. That's why I was married to and supported my husband and also a group of people who were fighting to abolish the police. They were fiercely opposed to the police and to prison. And my work supporting the grand jury resistors, which also led to more defense of grand jury resistors. That was a big period of my life that, I don't talk about that much, but I argued in court on behalf of people who were incarcerated because they stood up to government intimidation to try to put them in prison or get information out of them to be complicit in a system that was incarcerating and terrorizing people for their political views. And so that's part of why I am an abolitionist. It's that personal experience. It's that, being forced to make a commitment, and also just as much, though, the collaboration, the camaraderie that I have with other people who are impacted by the system and who are working together collectively to abolish it.
Well, thank you both. It's a difficult thing to ask someone and to ask of you. And I appreciate it so much that, you're willing to share what are the absolute worst moments of your life, so that people can understand why you do the work that you do. And I appreciate it so much.
Oh, I just want to add one thing. They were acquitted of all the charges having to do with a conspiracy to break, and the conspiracy was supposedly to break freedom fighters out of prison. And they were acquitted of those charges and all released from prison. So I want to add the great victory that we had as a result of organizing and standing up against the Giuliani regime. Some of you may not know this history of Rudy Giuliani as a U.S. attorney going after people for their political views back then. And so happy to see his demise today. I have to say, my former husband, he must be shouting from heaven, I think, because he didn't get to see it, but thank goodness for that. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure you knew that we do have victories in this movement.
And hopefully more victories to come. Dorothy, while you were speaking, I noticed that you used the phrase family policing system, and I no longer really say the child welfare system or foster care. People say the foster system. And Andrea, you refer to the criminal justice system instead as criminal legal system. We were talking yesterday about how we don't call juvenile detention. It's child jail or children's prison, I think you said. Mm-hmm. Why is language so important when we're discussing these issues?
Well, I want to lift up Eddie Ellis in this piece of this, for this particular question. Eddie was a great mentor of ours, and Eddie died prematurely of, illness that people who are buried in prisons for decades just come home. And Mujahid Fareed, another one of our incredible mentors as well, has passed away. Kathy Boudin, we just lost, our incredible mentor in this space. I mean, we could go on and on. Cherise Shoemate, who really helped us to understand for years ago, who died of sickle cell, but was buried in a women's prison and fought back, and had one of the first hearings led by incarcerated women from within a prison in California to raise awareness of the lack of appropriate and adequate health care for women. And so Sophia Bukhari, I mean, these are the women in particular that we lift up, but Eddie Ellis in particular came home from Attica and really started an institute to teach us, and wrote a letter as he was dying and instructed us to, as we do this work, to understand the absolute critical importance of language. You can't work on policy or shift narratives when you allow language that subjugates people to second class and third class and whatever else class citizenship, or no citizenship at all, or discounts the humanity of people. When we go into prison, we are immediately assigned a prison number, and we are immediately referred to as inmates. It is language like that that Eddie really gave us the language, the new language, to use, and the instruction to go out and shift the narrative, starting with language. When you're an inmate, you're being supervised by another human being that is just like you. They have a uniform on, but it's the language that they use initially as a weapon of the state to really begin to beat you down into submission of being an inmate, of being less than. It's not transformative. Convict, whatever. We're all bad mothers because we're in prison. But whatever language you can think of that the system continues to use is language that we don't use. The language that we use now is very simple. We're people. And you can describe us by starting with that, using that language. We're women who are incarcerated. We're women who were incarcerated. It's just one experience in our lives that we've gone through and are going through. And so language is very important, but Eddie Ellis really was the person who lifted that up as an issue. If you Google Eddie Ellis, language of incarcerated people, or anything like that, you guys are law students, you got queries. You know how to query something. You'll find it. You'll find the actual letter that Eddie left us with. And so language is absolutely important. Changing policy is literally impossible when you're using language that invokes fear, that invokes a narrative and a description of people that only continue to perpetuate fear. And that's what the language that the system currently uses does. And so we take great strides we've gone to meetings and we haven't been able to get the whole meeting is disrupted because the Department of Corrections sit across the table from us after we all agree on language, and then they continue to violate that. So it's a part of the violence of the state, and we really have to understand that we do have a language that describes us as human beings, and that we have a dignity and we have a right to be treated as such. And that will only change the systems when we change that language.
I talk about this with my students often. In so many statutes, we refer to people as illegitimate. We refer to people as alien. We were doing divorce grounds in Maryland. We said the insane person. And we talk about why we don't have to use that language, and why it's important not to do so. No person is illegitimate. No person is an alien. And the language is built into our laws. And I remember being in court, and we'd be talking about the most intimate details of my clients' lives down to what they had in their fridge. And we would be calling my client respondent mother. And I would say, no, thank you. Actually, you know her name. It is Miss so-and-so, and could you please address her as such? And, that's such an important thing to humanize each other and to respond. You're calling me Miss Trivedi. You can call my client by her name as well. Thank you. And why is it important for you, Dorothy?
Well, for all the reasons both of you just said, it's so true that language helps to shape the narrative and people's thinking about these carceral systems. It's interesting, as Andrea, you were talking about the language that's violent about human beings and turning human beings into objects, really, that can then be punished and tortured and treated inhumanely. There's also a way with the family policing system that it's kind of the opposite, which is it's benevolent language of child welfare and foster care and child protective services, which obscures the violence of the state. It obscures that this is not a system that seeks to truly help people or support people or improve children's welfare or care for people. It's a system that terrorizes families, parents and other family caregivers and children, but the language makes it seem as if it's some benevolent caregiving service for people, and that helps to promote this propaganda that the government has so effectively put out there that we shouldn't worry about the system because it's actually caring for children. And that's why I call it a family policing system, because that is what it does. It doesn't help, it doesn't support, it accuses. It all starts with an accusation, not with how can we help, but we will accuse you of harming your children, and then that leads to an investigation. It leads to sometimes years of supervision and surveillance and intervention into people's lives, which does not improve their lives, either the family caregivers or the children. And it also leads to the trauma, the terror. It's hard to even find the right words for it, because you're talking about seizing children from their families. That is possibly the most traumatic thing that can happen to somebody. And I've talked with many people also, as I just said, I've experienced the terror of having to think about, thank goodness I was not incarcerated myself, but I had to face that terror of being incarcerated. What's going to happen to my 2-year-old and my baby? And just even thinking about that, let alone going through having your children taken and not knowing what's happening to them, and perhaps knowing that they're being put into a system that we know is harmful, is abusive, is violent. That being called care is just an atrocity to call it that. So that's what this system does. It also permanently severs legal family relationships. And even though some people are able to find each other again, and many children who age out of the foster system, the first thing they do is try to find their families, but many are permanently separated from their families. And so this is a policing system. And I think it's important to describe it that way, both because that is a more accurate reflection of what the system does, but also it makes it clearer. This is why, there are various words people have come up with. I like policing because it also signifies the relationship between family policing and the criminal punishment system, and the way in which caseworkers work hand in hand with police, literally hand in hand, when they go into people's homes together to terrorize families. And also the logic of it is parallel, is the same. It's the logic of, if you have a need, the state is going to address it by punishing you. And broadly speaking, this is how the prison industrial complex and the family policing system work, materially hand in hand, but also the idea that people in America who have needs because of deep inequality, instead of radical change in our society to eliminate that inequality, we are going to punish those people by taking their children and putting them in cages. And policing, I think, lets people know this is a carceral web that is deeply entangled and works to surveil and investigate and punish and terrorize, not at all to care for people.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that intersection. I can't believe where I'm sitting, but I'm sitting between Andrea James and Dorothy Roberts, and the reason that we thought this was such a crucial it's so crucial to have the two of you here is because these systems intersect so often, and in a real way. Many people are simultaneously navigating a criminal case while navigating a family policing case, often also navigating a housing case, an immigration case. We are fortunate to have offices popping up thanks to the vision of Marty Guggenheim that, these holistic practices, right, where you can get a lawyer that helps you with all of this. But if you don't, I've had clients show up to court thinking that they had court today, but they showed up in the wrong court because they have so many court cases, they don't know which is the right courtroom. Can you talk to us about why, and how you talked to us a little bit about how police and caseworkers walk hand in hand, but how else do these systems intersect?
Well, they intersect by sharing information. That's one way, and many police departments and family policing departments have agreements to share information. They, as I mentioned, terrorize families together, but it's not just that they go into people's homes together, it's that because the so-called child protection services, it's hard to even say the words, are considered necessary to save children. They have certain powers that even police officers don't have. They have the power to force their way into people's homes, both because judges routinely ignore the fact that the Fourth Amendment applies to any government agent that wants to search your home. So that we have constitutional protections against caseworkers coming into our homes, but many people don't know that. But also, the caseworkers have the threat of taking your children away, which, as I said, to many people is the worst thing that could happen to them. And so they get entree into homes. Police then can use that entree, not only into homes, but into the entire expanse of people's private lives, which are considered important to protecting children. So, it's as if the family policing system allows the government to invade neighborhoods without having to convict the residents of crimes. It has that power. We don't even have to bother with the judicial protections you should get. And I'm not saying that people get them, but there's a recognition that there's certain protections that people who are charged with crimes should have. That isn't even recognized for families that are under investigation by the family policing system. And so it operates in a way in which the so-called benevolence of the family policing system expands the potential for state surveillance over the very neighborhoods that are already under surveillance by the prison industrial complex. And so there's that deep way in which these two systems support each other, the added terror of an armed officer and all of the power that police have, including the power to put you in prison, right? Or to put children into detention. All of those powers, on top of then and interacting with the powers that the family policing system has because it's considered necessary to protect children and can therefore get away with just going roughshod over people's rights. And that together is such a, it's mind-boggling, the expanse of the surveillance that this, and power this gives the government to control and disrupt entire communities. And then there's also the way in which, there's terms for it, crossover youth, dually involved youth. People think that children who have been taken from their families and put in the foster system are, have some kind of messed up minds, and that's why they end up in juvenile detention. You hear this all the time. Well, their families mess them up, and that's the reason why we have these high rates of incarceration of children who experience the foster system. But that's not what it is at all. It's that being in the foster industrial complex makes you vulnerable to being put into the criminal legal system, criminal punishment system. And so children who are in foster care, it's a pathway directly. I'm not even talking about some complicated pipeline, it's direct, because they put children into conditions of conflict and trauma, and then if the children run away or get into fights, or the staff thinks that they're not complying with the rules, what is the response? It's to call the police on them. There are other ways as well that this pathway works, but part of it is directly putting children into the system, and then also the way in which, and I'm sure Andrea will say more about this, she's already said a lot about it, the way in which being incarcerated puts you at risk of your children being taken from you. And many people who are caged have lost their relationships with their children. Their children are put in the foster system because of the way in which incarceration disrupts people's families. Obviously, you cannot take direct care of your child if you're caged in a prison. And so there's that as well, along with the sharing of charges. As Shanta said, the overlap of deportation and incarceration and family policing, family separation, they all work together. They're all sharing information, and they're all treating people in this extremely harsh, punitive, terrorizing way. And so there's I could go on with these connections. It's so deep. That's why I call it just a giant carceral web of punitive state approaches to the people who are the most harmed by structural inequality. It all works the same way, to say, if you have a need, we're going to punish you for it. And it supports more broadly the main obstacle to radical, in addition to, this is all supported by white supremacy and racial capitalism too, but it works as a direct obstacle to radical social change, that we need to have a society that is truly equal and humane and caring.
Yeah, thank you. Andrea, do you want to pick up on what happens? You were in the position, like you said, more fortunate than some, in that your kids stayed at home, right? They didn't have to go into the foster system. But what about your friends, your comrades who weren't so fortunate? What happens?
Well, I think, to speak directly to the question, I think that we often pay attention on the front end to police, and we pay a lot of attention on the back end to prisons, and we pay such little attention in the middle to the courts. And we're working with Andrea Ritchie and Mariam Kaba, Rachel Foran, some incredible folks who are working through interrupting criminalization and providing us with research and toolkits that we all make a contribution to as participatory researchers. And that work is called Abolishing the Courts. And when I was practicing law as a criminal defense attorney, I stood in countless courtrooms, but one in particular that I was in doing bar advocacy work after coming out of the Public Defender Agency through a project called the Youth Advocacy Project. In that court, the Chief Justice oversaw this court. And it was session one, arraignments, and during arraignments, if a person was pleading with Your Honor to, from behind the dock, and saying, I've been here all morning, they were stopped because of then marijuana was not legal. This was a very common charge in the community that I practiced in. And the odor of marijuana was the basis for probable cause. Countless times, no matter how many miles away you were from the car when you pulled it over. But hearing people who are parents, and as the court day, if any of you have been in criminal courts, you will know that the day drags on forever, and but you're trying to get out of there before the recess, which is from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And particularly for parents who had just been arrested, they haven't been convicted of anything. They've just been arrested for something. And they're pleading with the judge to please, my son or my daughter, my child is going to be dropped off by the school bus on the corner. And so these systems connect and they legitimize each other. And this particular judge, whenever, I mean, we got to a point where we were warning people, don't in all of your, just urgency to get out of this place, to go to be where your children are going to be left, because they will be entered into the system if a parent isn't there to pick them up. And we would say, don't say that. Don't say that, because this particular judge is going to immediately start an investigation for your children. And the other place where you really see how this works is that in prison, we're punished for all kinds of just ridiculous things. Wearing your uniform shirt not tucked in. Anything, you make it up. It's just made up, and it happens every day, all the time. And one of the ways that we're punished as women, as mothers, is to have our phone privileges taken away. And to have your phone privileges taken away, it's devastating. It's just absolutely devastating. And to watch mothers try and mother from a payphone is just in itself impossible. Our next thing that is taken away from us are our visits, sometimes both at the same time. I was in a federal prison, which means I was in a prison with a couple of thousand of women from all over the country and many women outside of the country. Most of us were mothers. Most of us, most of them, unlike myself, had not seen their children for years. Many of them received letters. Now, as you all know, family court matters are state court matters. If you are a woman in a federal prison, where in our law library, in the section of the prison where I lived, the only thing that was anything to do with a law book, any kind of law book, was a Sidney Sheldon novel, literally. And then we had these discs that were from Westlaw, but they were so outdated that you never had current case law if you even knew how to use this disc or knew how to do legal research using this technology. If you even knew, which nobody knew how to use it, you still have to hope and pray that there's something that gives you something to stand on as you are incarcerated in this prison, thousands of miles away from where your child is. And then you get a notice, and I'm clearly not the expert. Everything that I've learned about this, I learned from being in prison and having women come up to us with letters that they couldn't comprehend the loss of custody of their child because there was not a loophole in the Adoption Safe Families Act, which took account for women who were incarcerated. And if you don't know what it's like to live in a prison, to live in a women's prison, you need to understand that to hear a woman's cries, her muffled sobbing at 3 o'clock in the morning in a prison, to see a woman mopping floors, or to be in the chow hall and be at the table where a woman just can't hold it together another moment, where she collapses to the floor, where she is trying to not disturb other women as we are like a slave ship, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, living with each other in these prisons at 3 o'clock in the morning, where she is desperate, absolutely desperate, to reach out and hold her children and tell her child, I'm sorry that we're going through this. We're going to get through it. I'm going to find a way to get home. is something that will live with you forever. And the system uses those points as punishment, uses those little, so thin lifelines to our children as punishment. And then we come home, and not only as women do we have to find a place to live that we can afford, almost impossible in the United States right now. Not only do we have to jump through all of the parole hoops, halfway house hoops, urines, dehumanizing things that they put you through, continued strip searches, the actual incarceration of your bodies through the second phase of incarceration called parole system. You also now have to prove yourself to a system that you are worthy to be a mother to your children, and the hope that you haven't permanently lost them, and the hope that you can be reconnected with courts that won't allow you to come into a living space with your children in order to get them back unless you can have so many bedrooms or things that are just financially impossible when you're coming out of prison. And so that's how those systems they connect. And we have women who have been home for decades, whose sisters or cousins go into the prison system. And these women go, and they were already caring for the children that were their nieces and nephews or grandbabies. They were already caring for them, because that's what we do. As family, we step in when we can. But yet, when the mother actually goes into the prison system, there's now this investigation about where are your children. And when they determine that the mama is a woman who is formally incarcerated and has a conviction of a certain level, no matter what she has done with her life and on behalf of keeping her family together, the systems then work together to strip this woman who is mothering these children and keeping the family together to the best of her ability, takes those children because of the prior conviction of the caretaker now of the family. And so these systems, it is all the family policing system since slavery. The system and the treatment of women in the carceral system are all created from the treatment of Black women during slavery, and the callousness, the violence, the cruelty, the terrorism of the separation of us from our children. And so we have to really understand that this is a system of great harm, intentional great harm, and that we really have to do the work we're doing today, all of you here, to create the change.
Thank you so much. I just want to explain for those of you who don't know what Andrea meant by the Adoption and Safe Families Act. There is a federal law that says if your children are in foster care for 15 out of the last 22 months, your parental rights will be terminated. And you can imagine if you're incarcerated for that period, your options are pretty limited in terms of how you will ever get your children back. It's an automatic termination, right? Before you even have a chance.
And they're not going to take you from federal prison to the state courthouse. They're not going to do that. Even if you have the means to get yourself there, they're not going to give you the furlough to go. So you can't even show up in person to fight for your children.
I've had clients who had simultaneous cases open, and I'd say to the judge, Your Honor, he can't testify in this case. He's got an open criminal case. I'd like an adjournment. I'm sorry. As if the privilege against self-incrimination doesn't apply. And in fact, you can get a negative inference against you, meaning that
you are presumed to have done something wrong because you're not testifying, even though we know that the reason that you're not testifying is because you have an open criminal case and the stakes are so high. I want to talk a little bit about this word abolition. It makes people very nervous. We know that. People do not like that word. It scares them. They don't understand what it means. What does that word mean to you? What is abolition? What does that vision of, what is the future that you are envisioning in a post-abolition world?
Yeah, to me, abolition is about a vision of a world that is humane, that truly cares for people, that truly supports families, that truly meets children's needs, that doesn't punish people as a condition of a fake way of meeting people's needs. And getting there, working toward it, while we, at the same time, create the world that doesn't need to cage people and take people's children away from them. And it's interesting that people find it a scary word when we have a history of liberating people through abolition. You know, in the United States, there's a movement to abolish slavery. And shouldn't we agree that was a good thing, right? That abolition is the way of working toward a society which is the one that we should want. We shouldn't want what Andrea and I have been describing here of a society that terrorizes families, that punishes people, that cages people, that traumatizes families by taking their children away. Why would we want a society like that? Now, people who want it have a stake in what it props up. You know, it props up a society that benefits an elite, and then through the various forms of propaganda we've been talking about, somehow convinces people that they have a stake in this brutal society. But abolition means that we come together and we have a common vision of a society where there is housing for everybody, decent housing, high-quality housing for everybody, high-quality medical care for everybody, high-quality nutrition for everybody. All the things that right now people are having their children taken away from them for, we have that. We don't take children away from their caregivers on some grounds of they're not fit, when in fact, that isn't the reason at all. And, you know, Andrea, when you were talking, I was thinking about how what you were describing was deliberately disrupting families, terrorizing families, punishing families, because the state knows that that is going to be the worst thing that could happen to those mothers. And yet, the argument is that those mothers don't really love and care for their children. That's why the children should be taken away. But we know, you know, the agents of the state know that there are loving, caring bonds, and that's why they use that to punish the families. But then the propaganda is, well, it's okay to take them away because that's what's saving them. We want a society where you don't have to suffer in order to have your needs met in a way that doesn't actually meet your needs at all. You know, that is only there to prop up the most elite people. And so abolition, it means a vision of something that's better. You know, that's the kind of world we would want to live in, and working collectively toward it. I think another reason why people find it scary is they think that, and again, I'm not sure why, because those of us who are abolitionists never talk about just abandoning children to be harmed. We're talking about ending harm to children and creating the ways that would truly meet children's needs, truly keep children safe, truly support families. But I think there's a misunderstanding that people think that abolition is just tearing things down and I don't know, leaving people to fend for themselves. That's the opposite of what we're working for. We're working to actually support families and meet people's needs. That's what abolition is about. And we are not just dismantling piece by piece the carceral systems that we have now. Stop building prisons, stop funding police, stop taking children from their families, but also, just as important, creating the ways that people can rely on for true support and true caring, so that we have a world where it is just inconceivable that you would think that it protects children to tear them away from their families. It would be inconceivable to think that you stop violence by caging and torturing people. You know, that it's clear, that's absurd. That's what we're working toward, a society where it's laughable that what the state does now would be seen as somehow benefiting people.
Yeah. Well, I everything that Dorothy just said.
I say that often.
And you know, just the bottom line for us is that abolition is about stopping the caging of Black bodies in this country and everywhere else globally. But also, as Dorothy pointed out, it's not just about stopping things, it's about building things. It's about creating what we refer to as what different looks like.
Yeah.
We don't, you know, we know for sure, those of us that live, have had the experience and also live in the most entangled neighborhoods, that we already don't call the police where I live. You know, it's police and prisons don't create healthy, thriving communities. And so we're working towards the communities that we want to live in, not only trying to deal with the very difficult issues of what do you do about violence in the communities and so forth, and prison is never going to stop that. That's the last place you want to send somebody if you want to help them to transform and heal. Prison is not the place to send a person. And so that's not ever going to be the answer. It's a way of oppressing and controlling particular communities, and that's exactly what it is. And so we have to, continue to build. We've also included in that what brings you joy. When we try and think about our work, where do you have to go in your times of joy with your families, with your children, with your elderly parents? Like, what is that? What is that vision that we don't have right now in our neighborhoods? And so we do a lot of work. We just stopped a new $50 million women's prison in Massachusetts. We've derailed the building of a mega complex in Alabama. Of course, they're not going to stop. They just dropped an RFP to build a new women's prison in Vermont. We're in that fight. There's a new jail they're proposing as they move women out of Rosie's into someplace else, borough in New York City. We're in that. We're in a lot of these things that are against what the system is doing. But the most important work in the buckets that we work in at the National Council is our work that we call reimagining communities. And I know we're out of time, but I really want to just mention this very quickly. After a 2.5-year listening tour of what different looks like around the country, led by incarcerated women and formerly incarcerated women, because our community doesn't stop at the prison gates. Every single thing we do includes the work and the input and the expertise of incarcerated women and girls. But what they came up with was the Reimagining Communities framework that we work through. And it's a very hyper-local way of organizing our sisters out of the system, because the system is not going anywhere anytime soon, and we're very acutely aware of that. But to us, we have a million toolkits. We have bookcases that run the length of the office space, and there's toolkits everywhere. And we just said one day, we're going to actually take these down and pull them apart and figure out what are the pieces of this toolkit that are giving us direction that fits in right now today. Stop talking about it and get on the ground and start creating. And so we've been doing that. We're in our neighborhoods creating what different looks like for us on our own dime. It's exhausting financially, emotionally, but that's what women are doing in the communities, and just finally saying, enough is enough. We know nobody's coming to save us. And the way that you guys save us, we don't want no more.
Exactly.
So and it has everything from freight farms that we've invested in that grow fresh produce year round, literally in a shipping container. It's participatory defense. It's transformative justice. It's food pantries. It's pamper pantries. It's alternative crisis response teams. All the things that the sisters are in Detroit now preparing to talk about at the Free Her conference. So that's abolition to us.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's just a matter of, we have to stop looking for the answers. And I'm sorry for people who are afraid of it. I'm absolutely sorry, because in your communities, you're afraid of it because you feel it's going to take something away from your privilege and the abolition lives that you live in every day.
Exactly.
And we can't be concerned about your fear any longer. We have to just deal with our own circumstances and pick ourselves up and start to create what different looks like. And that's, for us, that's what abolition is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always ask, when people are so resistant to abolition, and they know all the harm the system inflicts, they know it. And some of the people who know it the most, who are working in it, are the ones who resist. And the question for me is always, what is your investment in this system that you don't want to give it up?
That's right.
What is your investment? And I'm telling you, you could always find they're invested in some way that they don't want to give it up. And I agree with you, Andrea. Forget them.
Right.
Forget them. We have to move on to do the work we know we have to do.
And I'll shut up, I promise.
Yeah, go on.
They named it, the sisterhood across the country, countless convenings over 2.5 years, in and out of prison, and in 6 months of dumping it all on the table to create reimagining communities. But the sisterhood named it Reimagining Communities, the hyperlocal work on the ground, because it was a narrative that was led by major, large nonprofits that are not led by directly affected people, that have been extracting millions of dollars out of this space for years under a narrative called Reimagining Prisons. And we're tired.
Yeah.
Those of us who were entangled and lived in prisons and had loved ones who were dragged in and out, and every day we are dealing with somebody in a prison, we were tired of reimagining prisons. So there is a real reason that the sisterhood named the hyperlocal organizing we do Reimagining Communities.
We are near the end, and I want to leave time for a question or two, but I wanted to ask a quick question because, we're talking about this stuff. It's very heavy. The work is hard. And I have been doing this work like a fraction of what you're doing for a fraction of the time. And I am so tired. I am really tired. And I can't imagine how you feel. And, for our law students, for our young lawyers who want to go out, they want to be a part of this. They believe in what you believe in, this vision where people have the things they need to thrive and they can live in a way that they feel free. How do you do this work, sustain it, sustain yourselves? What do we tell them?
Well,
She's like, don't.
As someone who works a lot in academia, I could say that if I only worked on writing books, I would be extremely depressed, But I find, and I don't know how academics who just write books and articles, how if they're writing about all of the violence of the state and the deep inequalities in our society, I don't know how they don't just get extremely tired. But for me, what sustains me is working collectively with people like you, Andrea, and you, Shanta, and Joyce McMillan, and Marty Guggenheim, and others who, and again, I can't mention all the names out there, who are comrades in this struggle, where we celebrate our victories. It's not just bemoaning the terrible state we're in. You know, as Andrea just listed, all the things that the sisterhood is doing. And yes, we know that there are going to be more prisons built, but we also know that we have stopped the building of prisons. You know, we know the family police are still going to go out there, but yes, JMAC for Families, we are going to get the New York State Assembly to give Miranda rights at some point, right, to parents. You know, there are victories. That's why I stopped and said, when I was talking about the New York 8 trial back in the 1980s, to say, oh, but by the way, they were acquitted. You know, there are victories that we have to celebrate, even as we see setbacks, even as we see this is a huge carceral mammoth apparatus. But we are succeeding in chipping away at it, and we are succeeding in building replacements for it that we can be joyful about and celebrate. You know, I have always loved just being at reproductive justice meetings with Black women because we always have a party. You know, I mean, I think this is so different from when I present a paper at a workshop at the law school, you know, and everybody's sitting around all dire and, you know, and thinking I'm out of my mind for the things that I said. You know, that I could even think of one when I wrote Abolition Constitutionalism. One of my colleagues said, but you're so disrespectful of the Constitution, Dorothy. You know? But anyway, you know, there's some value to presenting papers, but it's so different from when I'm in a reproductive justice meeting and we're having a party celebrating the victories that we've had. And that's what gives me joy and keeps me going, is knowing that collectively we are going to win. I may not see it in my lifetime, the total abolition, but we have victories and we are going to win. So that's what keeps me going.
Well, I'll just briefly just say I'm completely mentally ill from this work. Believe me, but there's a lot of joy, a lot of joy, and being in the community every day. I live in the community, being a part of all of the. We never have a meeting without food. Mm-hmm. Just coming together and being in sisterhood with one another is just what sustains me, and the urgency that has never left me of the women that I know are there, women who are dying, women who should come out. We have a very aggressive clemency work that we do. We have 100 women right now, 99 now, because Martha Evanoff has died, who are dying in prison, as the Louisiana governor just proudly stood with a shovel in his hand to break ground for a new $90 million women's prison, and gloating about, and we're going to build a beautiful hospice. You know, we just stay close. We're very close at the National Council. And we're very unapologetic. We're not always understood, because we have drawn that line in the sand. We've created a platform that is being used by a lot of formerly incarcerated women, and that's great, and everybody needs to tell their story, and they need that platform to do it, and many are doing it now, but we always say if you decide to step out of that space of telling your story, and you begin to talk in a manner that you're affecting policy and change, and it's not through an abolitionist Black feminist lens, you need to sit down. You need to go and get politicized. You need to go and do some struggle. You need to go and understand and learn the historical and political context of the work that we do. And we're not liked by a lot of folks. And that's okay for us because we intend on ending incarceration of women and girls and everyone else. And so we do the work the way that we do it. So, thank you.
So I think we have time for one, maybe two questions, probably one. So if you have a question, I'm looking at my students. Anybody got a question, you get priority. I know many of you, thank you to those professors who canceled their classes so that the students could attend. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you guys are here. Anyone have a question? We need it because we're recording. We want to make sure we get your question.
You guys have told really inspiring stories, and I was wondering, have you ever considered writing a book telling that story?
Well, they've each written some books. Do you mean about their personal stories?
Yeah.
Their personal stories, yes.
Yeah, I've written several books, including a Torn Apart, which is about family policing. But, as I said, they have the stories of other people who have inspired me to be an abolitionist. I have never written the story of my encounter with incarceration and my support and involvement and engagement and love for incarcerated people, in my personal life. I've thought about maybe writing an essay about it at some point, and I've been encouraged to do that now that I've talked more about it recently. This all happened in the 1980s. It's a long time ago. But I have thought about, in particular, writing about having to make a decision to oppose the police and the carceral system at the risk of being incarcerated. This the moment in your life when you have to decide what are my true commitments and what am I willing to do to support and further those commitments, again, in solidarity with other people. I think that's something personally that was important to me that I'd like to share with others, and maybe one day I will write that essay about it. But I have other writing projects in the works now. I have to meet those deadlines first. So,
are you busy?
Right.
But you heard it here first. Dorothy Roberts will be writing an essay about her personal.
Yes, one day.
And Andrea, you of course have written your book about.
Well, I wrote it. I did. It saved my life when I was in prison writing, and I wrote a book called Upper Bunkies Unite. And in prison, we are either a lower bunkie or an upper bunkie in the prison that I was in. That's what we pass in the hallway. Hey, bunkie. And I had several bunkies before I left. But that book, I wrote it like I speak. There were no computers. You couldn't do research. You couldn't spell check. I spelled Lonnie Ganier's name wrong to my mother's great horror. And it's like I just started to talk. And that's what the book is like. You can get through it pretty easily. Law students could probably read it in a night. But it is about, it's a memoir. And I wrote it while I was in prison. I came out with only the box in my socks because I left everything behind for the women who had to stay there. Mm-hmm. And I had this box with my manuscript in it. And all handwritten. And I didn't change a word of it. I didn't even make any corrections because I knew if I started to tinker with it once I got outside, it would not be the same book. Mm-hmm. And I wanted it to reflect my mental state. I wanted it to reflect what I was seeing, what I was thinking about. And so it's on Amazon. Go buy it.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you for all your wonderful work. I'm one of those academics that write books and write articles, but my passion has always been child welfare. And one of the things that we're working with in the School of Social Work at Morgan State University is that we are consciously trying to prepare our students to dismantle a corrupt system. Unfortunately, what we're getting is many students and many organizations believe that they're doing a good thing. So my question is, how can we work in a multidisciplinary fashion, working with law students and working with law programs to understand how child welfare can be not only a part of the problem, but they can be the problem in their coercive nature and getting parents and children separated and re-traumatizing them. So I just need your ideas on how we can change the curriculum so we can have a better prepared professional staff to work with a really corrupt system.
Yeah.
I'm going to get my pen.
Well, but the thing is that social work has always been deeply entangled with carceral systems, and especially the family policing system. And in fact, some people equate social work, unfortunately, with working for state family policing systems. And most schools of social work are preparing their students to be complicit in this system. So, okay, but I said most. If that's not mostly what they do, they have a program. A big part of the curriculum and the training is to train students from the minute they step into the school to work for the family policing system. I have given talks to these programs and had students who just started their training, and they're telling me how they're already bossing families around. I remember once going into, and I stopped, I said, wait a minute, how long have you been in this program? This is a part of our training. We just got here. I said, you just got here and you think you have the authority and the expertise, to boss families around and tell them how to determine their lives and report them? And they're, oh yes, this is how we're being trained, as experts in how families should be treating their children. So it's a whole mentality of social work that has to be abolished. And one way to do it is simply to stop training students to work for the family policing system.
Right.
Let Morgan be one, in addition to Dean Alan Detlef, who's leading the University of Houston, Graduate College of Social Work, and others who are recognizing that either we stop social work altogether, or I don't know if it needs a name change, I don't know what technically needs to be done, but we have to completely abolish the idea of social workers as professional experts who assist the state in policing families, because that's what social work is now. It doesn't have to be, but, pardon me? Yes, exactly. Some cops are called caseworkers. So we want to stop that. And I think there is a huge now opportunity for schools of social work to train their students to oppose family policing and to figure out where can the students that we're training work to abolish the system, and importantly, abolishing it means replacing it right now with actually supporting families, actually keeping children safe, actually caring. How can social work do that instead? And that is an important mission for schools of social work today. So that's my overall message. Stop training students to work as agents for family policing systems, and train them to actually be supporters in communities apart from the whole carceral logic and entanglement with the current family policing system.
Thank you so much for your question.
I just want to say one thing really quickly. Read Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionists, if you're law students in particular, please. And I want to plug something shamelessly. We are building a think tank at the National Council that is off of the nonprofit industrial complex grid. We are doing it by selling 40,000 T-shirts. I'm wearing it. It is at a website called,
We knew. Joyce, you got us to curse.
it is at a website called freeherinstitute.com. freeherinstitute.com. Please go onto the website, buy a T-shirt, spread the word, share the link. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our keynotes. We appreciate you. Oh, and as a reminder, Dorothy will be signing her books outside. They're available for purchase. We'll make our way over there.
Thank you.